So, okay, so what I've seen is a spectrum, like you've said. There's a spectrum from the very, very fearful. So, you know, people that I know that are concerned about dying from this virus if they get it because they're in the age bracket where that's a realistic possibility, or their immune system is compromised to some degree already, and so it's a threat to them. And so for them, this was a very, very real thing that posed real danger. And their reaction was quite intense. It was, I want to isolate myself as much as possible. I don't want anyone coming around me. I don't want anyone that lives with me to be in the vicinity of anyone on any other property. For example, like there's a self-contained unit on my property, and those are the people that I interact with. Anyone on my property that then interacts with another person, that's not okay by me, and I'll have a strong reaction to that. So that there's also been people that I know being very, very skeptical of the virus at all, like conspiracy theory type. Does the virus even exist? If the virus does exist, is it as bad as people say it is? Is the infection rate as bad as people say? Is the death rate as bad? Like, is this just political positioning? And how do I make sense of all of that? Like, what is even real? Who can I trust? Even if what the official narrative about what the virus is and how it's spread is accepted as true, what then should our response be in terms of vaccines? Like, and people that have been anti-vaxxers in the past, like take a stance against vaccination, that's been difficult for them to come to grips with the reality of where we're at with this pandemic and how, to my mind, my opinion, how necessary vaccination is if we're to return to some semblance of normal, and then what that means for them if they choose to get vaccinated or not. So there's been that conspiracy theory kind of take on it and all the paranoia that comes with that. And then I guess there's been, like, level-headed sense making somewhere in the middle, like trying to figure out what's true, but not reactionary or emotional about it, just kind of sensible, I would say. And then there's the similar to what you were describing, the people that will just ignore it and not really pay much attention to it, or will actually make sense of it through a proxy, like someone else, or they'll accept opinion of a close friend or a trusted friend and be like, I'm not looking at the data myself or reading the news or anything like that. I'm just kind of like, whatever, it'll be what it'll be, and I'll be okay. Like, kind of naively burying their head in the sand. So yeah, it's been all of those things, and it has been fascinating to watch, both on the individual level and on the cultural level, how we've tried to grapple with that. Because I agree with what you were saying about it, the virus not even necessarily being the most interesting part of this, but us as human beings, how we internalize phenomena and how we then choose to respond, or not even consciously respond, but react, like somatically and viscerally react
and unconsciously, and more than consciously. Yeah, exactly, that's where the potency is.
Yeah. So yeah, so many different reactions. Yeah, it's been fascinating.
Yeah, it has. I think if we had our wits about us more, we'd be able to undertake. I'm sure people are, but probably not enough taking proper stock of like what it is that has happened and taking it under close examination, not just not just medical examination, but examination from a variety of different vantages, not least the psychological one and the spiritual one, because this has become something wholly. This has become something this has become a higher order problem, of course, yes, right? Yes. A much higher order problem. And it's the higher order version of the problem that I find much more terrifying and also much more fascinating, right? Because it's that is what will linger, and whatever that evidence is, I think what we ought to be paying very close attention to, right? What does this activate within us? What has been activated, especially when it's been activated beyond our consciousness and control? Yes. What has it brought out in us, particularly when we haven't been able to sufficiently monitor our own reactions to things, when we've been possessed of convictions, or possessed of whims, or possessed of impulses that were unknown to us, and that assume our capacity to opine to the point where we say things without having reckoned with them properly, without having fully explored them, right? Take perspectives that are unfounded, become occupied with fears that are revealed to be relatively unsound, and yet at the same time seem so real that they change the entire phenomenology of the world when we walk outside, right? Before you start recording, I was relaying to you that story of had a family member who had this visceral reaction to the sight of a crowd, and suddenly became quite not reflectively, unreflectively intolerant of the very notion, of the very idea of being in close range of other people. And then to me, it brings in all kinds of other questions about the threshold of risk that we tolerate on a day-to-day basis as a consequence of being alive in the first place, right? We get in cars and we drive, and so there are all kinds of performative contradictions going on here too, right? Risk tolerance varies by domain or by activity, and it doesn't add up in any empirical way, right? A lot of those patterns of behavior don't rationally add up in any way that would be commensurate with a scientific or medical perspective, right? And yet we're taking a position that alleges to be very rational when we try to protect ourselves from certain things, not realizing that we take all kinds of risks every day in order to live meaningfully, because there is no living meaningfully without assuming a certain amount of risk. And so it's a tricky one. It's fascinating though. It's fascinating, sometimes perversely, because of course the fascinations come at a great cost.
Yes.
But we'll see.
What's really interesting to me is the degree of certainty to which people present their opinions. So it's, to me, having an opinion is inevitable. Everyone is living in this environment and interacting with people and seeing the news and all this kind of stuff. So you're gonna land somewhere with what you think about what's going on. But it's interesting that the incentive to jump to certainty is so strong that people will jump there and stay there, and then dig in that position, even when presented with evidence to the contrary, quite convincing evidence to the contrary. And I can relate to that, because I was telling you, just before that, my experience of early in the pandemic was one of fear and insecurity, like watching institutions crumble a little bit and being like, wow, I didn't know we were this vulnerable in Western society. I thought we were a little bit more capable of handling a crisis like this. And so it was very tempting for me to jump to a strong opinion and stay there, because then at least I have a direction that I can move in, and a clear plan as to how I should be acting and how things should be around me, to get out of that fear and insecurity feeling. It's like, well, I don't feel so insecure now because I know what's happening and I know what I should be doing in response to it. But that wasn't my experience. My experience was, well, I'm insecure, but also I'm uncertain about what it is that's actually happening and what my response should be to it. So I just have to stay with this insecurity for a little while and be okay that that's present for me right now, while attempting to listen to people that I trust on these kinds of subjects, Rebel Wisdom for me is a channel that, a YouTube channel that attempts to make sense in real time and brings in subject matter experts in a very, in a way that I really appreciate. And listening to people like Jordan Hall and Daniel Schmachtenberger and Jamie Wheel and these kinds of people that see the landscape of COVID and then can kind of present their opinions in a logical way and also present the data upon which they are basing those opinions. So that to me gives me a sense of clarity. So I've been trying to listen to voices, I guess, that sound reasonable to me, in order to combat that insecurity to some degree. Yeah. But yeah, so I guess the point that I was making was, it's interesting watching the certainty to which people will jump very quickly and then stay there and defend it very strongly.
Yeah, I mean, especially if it's a security that's or a kind of certitude that's based in is based on an empirical impression. Mm-hmm. I think those are the kinds that are particularly insecure, and I think that's a bit different than taking a particular philosophical perspective on the matter and decide how information is going to signify to you, which I think is different than making an assumption of the facts as the facts change before your eyes. Yeah. And it's because this I mean the scientific, as it were, for lack of a better term, appraisal of the situation was in constant flux.
Yes.
But there was a certain amount of foolishness, I think, in tethering one's perspective as to how to relate to what was going on, to tether it to that changing field of information. Mm-hmm. Because the field of information was always going to remain in flux. Mm-hmm. But the frame of perspective that determines how that information is going to become significant in the first place, that it's at that level of resolution, I think, that was unconscious to most people.
Yeah.
The way in which the facts became relevant, that level of framing, I think, is the level of framing that was unconscious to most people.
Yes.
So when they say follow the science, it already presumed a certain attitude or a certain complexion or disposition that framed the significance of the information before the information even arrived.
Yes.
Right. And I think that the task to me became to back ourselves, each individual, really, because I certainly don't think it's happened in any collective way, except in pockets, perhaps. But I think the task was to back ourselves up onto the framing perspective that would determine how to appropriate the information that came in from out in the world, right? Peugeot had a really good video, I think, about this a little while back, but sort of, calling into question the whole notion of following the science, because ultimately it's the structure of valuation that the science feeds into. That is what must be tested. That is what must be examined, right? What comes before it, what must be examined, right? Not to say that the data is irrelevant or unimportant, but you know what I mean? It rests on a foundation, and it's the foundation. It's the invisible foundation or the unconscious foundation of belief and value. I think that the best that COVID could have done is to call that fundamental ground into question properly. Now, I don't think it, as a culture, I'm not sure it did that. For individuals, I think for many individuals, perhaps it did. I hope it did. It will have done some good if that's true.
Yes.
It will have done some good. But even that, of course, and I struggled with that too, right? Of determining how this information was going to become important, what it meant in terms of what to do about it, right? Because it's not obvious what to do about it, right? Even if a danger level increases out in the field of data, it's not obvious immediately what to do if the danger level increases, right? And because, like I said, we take purposeful, meaningful risks all the time in order to live, in order to gain existential traction in our day-to-day lives, right? So, where you set the threshold of toleration, what you're able to take on, obviously it varies from person to person. And I think that what's been debated is, the there's no consensus. There's no consensus. I mean, there has been an artificial consensus created by ordinance. And it's out of respect for ordinance or lack thereof, interestingly, that consensus has been artificially achieved in many places, right? And it's what you and I were talking about this before you hit the record button. It's interesting that cultures that are perhaps a little bit more, I'm simplifying, but you know what I mean. Cultures that are a bit more predisposed in their complexion to be more obedient to the fiats of state, for instance, respond collectively in a certain way. And those cultures that are less accustomed to responding in more collective or collectivist ways respond very differently, right? And whether the emphasis on discrimination is more oriented to the individual or more oriented to the collective. And so I think even in cases where there has been a presumed cultural consensus as to where the level of risk should be calibrated, it's often been achieved simply because at some point legislatures have decided, okay, here's where we need to set the bar. And maybe in some cases those decisions were reasonable, and in some cases I think they probably weren't. And but at the level of the individual per individual, there still remains a broad eclecticism, right?
Yes.
Each individual making a very, very different choice as to how much, where they're going to set that threshold, and how the information is going to be framed, what its meaning, how it's going to signify, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And to a large degree, that's healthy that we have individuals within society with different frames of reference than the government has, and to be a dissenting voice, to offer different opinions, so that we're not just abiding authority blindly, and we are being rational in our approach as much as we possibly can. And if those voices start to become amplified because there's some signal there, then great, we can have a look at it and try to determine what's true in what's being amplified. And yeah, I like the way you sort of outlined the frame by which we view things, stepping back behind the science and the data to a much more fundamental level, to how we actually view what's relevant to us in any given circumstance. And yeah, I guess what comes to mind for me is John's relevance realization machinery. And how do we actually make sense of the world? What becomes salient to us in different circumstances? And why is that? Why does certain things become super salient to me in certain situations? What's the mechanism driving that inside me? Is it certain biases that I have? Is it certain fear reactions? Is it certain disgust mechanisms inside of me? And becoming conscious of that, so I can make some choices around that, instead of unconsciously becoming a slave to those things inside of myself. Yeah.
Well put. Yeah. And I think that in many ways is the task. I think that's like, if I was to anthropomorphize the entire pandemic for a moment, the entire virus, I would say that is the task that it has assigned us as individuals, is to do that reflective work, to determine to try and source out those unconscious reactions and try to prescind some of the projections that have been foisted upon the virus, that have changed its nature before our eyes, right? And graduated it to orders of realness that perhaps it didn't start with, what I mean? And, right? Because it is real in ways that have nothing to do with it as a biological entity.
Yes.
And I think, like I said at the beginning, I think those forms of realness to me are the more pressing and demand the more attention, because they are those that correspond to the forms of realness inside of us, right? And unfortunately, I think for many people, those will end up having gone unquestioned, and, fair enough. But I think for some, perhaps not. And it's been interesting, One of the things that I found telling about it is that I have gotten to know some people that I already knew well. I've gotten to know them in a way even better as a consequence of all of this, right? You must have had that experience too,
Yeah.
right? People reveal dimensions of themselves in response to a condition like this.
Yes, definitely.
And that revelatory provocation can be very, very useful. It can be it can be oppressive, but it can be very useful as well.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. Can I ask you what, say this process that you've gone through of determining what your fundamental frame is and then what you should do in response to this pandemic, where have you landed with that? Like, how have you made sense of it, and where are you now with what you should be doing in response?
Yeah, well, I mean, I remain, when it comes to people, obviously people especially that I know well, or people that I love, people that I'm close to, who I know who I know are physically more vulnerable and at greater risk. To me, they're a sort of they comprise a category of care that is distinct and that has sort of distinct needs, and I attend to it. I attend to those situations almost independently, as I would probably in any similar in any situation where there was a danger of infection. I mean, even if it was the flu, right? I would probably take a similar amount of care. Now, definitely, the care has been certainly embellished by the internalized. I mean, no matter how much care I've taken to reason and to become conscious of my own reactions, there's no doubt that I have sometimes, in spite of myself, internalized the sense of collective hypochondria that we've now all been afflicted with. I don't think there was any getting around that, right? So certainly, I make that comparison very loosely. Obviously, they're not quite the same thing. But anyway, I would say that people who have a physical vulnerability, I've tended to mind those dangers, I would say, more carefully. Otherwise, I would say I probably fall sort of towards I have a much higher toleration, I would say. Now, perhaps easy to say as, someone who's relatively young and healthy. That's a luxury. I'm fortunate for that. But I also I've been unconvinced, frankly, of the need to suspend all dimensions of life that sustain a sense of meaningfulness. I have not been willing to hang all of those up. And I would say that perspective has fortified itself over the course of time. I would say in the initial months of the pandemic, like everyone else, I had no idea what, who knew what the heck was going on, what we were dealing with, right? It was like force majeure, everybody button down, what's going on, the storm's coming. And certainly, like I would say, certainly affected by that tidal wave of apprehension in the way that a lot of other people were to some degree. But I think as time went on, and it became clear to me that with some certain very basic precautions, which are just, I think equivalent to common sense in many ways, life could persist in some form. Sociability, close relations could persist, and they could do so within a certain degree of convention. And safely enough. And there was a bit of a trial and error to that. Okay, let's see how this goes, right? Cautiously at first, but I think it became clear to me once I got into a certain rhythm that life could indeed persist, and it did not all have to be held in abeyance until such a day, if it may come that the world may reopen. I became And again, this is probably to some degree a matter of personal temperament, but I was quite affronted at the idea that, especially that a state could could abbreviate the life of the individual and force their spirit into a state of clustration and force them back on their heels in such a deep and profound existential way that they were cut off from those things that became the sources of their vitality, you know. And it's a tricky one, right? Because in some circumstances, under certain conditions, yeah, you know, it's fair. Sometimes there truly is a need. I would say as time went on, I became less and less and less convinced of that need. I became less convinced that this was a situation that warranted the kind of dramatic totalitarian, and I say totalitarian in the sense of its original and proper meaning, right? A set of codes that whose intention was to encompass the totality of life.
Yeah.
From the way you interact with your family, to the way that you interact with your chosen passions and hobbies, to the way that you interact with your education, to the way that, you know, at the level of, right down to the level of the inmost personal relations that constitute the you know, your most your closest sense of meaning, right? And the idea that the idea that those things could be, the idea that by ordinance people could be forced into a state of spiritual privation by a set of rules that were completely heedless of the existence of such a thing didn't sit well with me, and still doesn't, because the state per se is blind to the existence of spirit in many ways. That's not its function. Its function is not to attend to spirit, right? It attends to the relative equilibrium of society, and it certainly attends to the health and security of the body. And God, that's not unimportant. We do need that. God knows, right? Otherwise, you know, I think if you don't believe that, then you're veering into anarchy or something like that. And that's certainly not what I'm saying. But I think that to me, this was a clear indication that we have lost the capacity as a culture to compare virtues against one another and determine the proper order of those virtues, and to determine which virtues are actually superordinate to others, and which are, you know, to get the right order of the categories, I guess you might say, right? And the affordances for spirit, you know, allowing people the means of it's like, it's not freedom for freedom's sake that I'm talking about, right? It's the capacity, it's the freedom insofar as it's a means to cultivating oneself and choosing company to some degree is necessary in order to maintain spirit, in order to keep it stoked, in order to keep it lit. And I think for a lot of people, when deprived of that capacity, they were plunged into kind of an abyssal state that I should say collectively, we're just not prepared to deal with, right? And I think that there was more than a little bit of myopia to that, right? I think that from a state perspective, it's like, well, we'll just keep all of these bodies safe, you know, and then they'll be safe, and we'll preserve them until such a time when we can let them out again, and all will be as it was. Again, I'm making a straw man out of them a little bit. It wasn't quite that simplistic, but I think, you know, there is some of that thinking.
Yeah.
It's just not that simple. And so I think that our collective formal or institutional reaction to the virus, I think, was indicative that we carry an abbreviated definition of the self and the person.
Yes.
Because we were not prepared to treat the problem at the level of personhood, at the level of the self. And maybe that would have certainly been too much to expect from that machinery anyway, because that's not what that machinery is for. And I think the lesson here is, among others, that if ever we needed more evidence that we've lost the machinery that corresponds to the tutoring of the Spirit and the pedagogy of the Spirit, it was this. Because that's what that, right? Where was the spiritual leadership? I hate to use the word spiritual because it's taken on this like fluffy, frivolous connotation, but I think you know the sense in which I mean it, Maitreya.
Yeah.
And I think, who is going to minister to the Spirit? Obviously, people who have their pockets of spiritual communities, those who still have such things, ostensibly rounded on them. But a lot of people, of course, don't have any such thing anymore.
Yeah.
And so they made a category mistake, an understandable category mistake, but this comes back to the following the science thing. They looked for spiritual ministering. They looked for that in the direction of the medical enterprise or the political enterprise. And they were not prepared to give that. They were only prepared to treat the problem at a certain level of resolution. And beyond that, they were at a loss as to how to minister to the spirit of the individual. And that's why all of the techniques and mechanisms and strategies they came up with, by and large, for tending to COVID as a virus, as a pandemic, did not mind that gap. They did not mind that gap, right? They treated it as though it was not there. And I think because of that, that to me was that was an affront to the Spirit to me, and I think that and to me it revealed the deep. It's not even failing, because, like I said, those particular machines, it's not their function to minister that way.
Yes.
It's not their function to minister that way, and a lot of people looked to them to minister that and found them wanting. Of course they were wanting. That's not what they do, right? Don't look to your political leaders for sage advice. Sorry, you're not going to get it from them, right? Don't look to physicians to be metaphysicians. It's not the same thing, right? And that's not an aspersion on either of those roles necessarily. They both have their function and purpose. But again, that kind of cultural category mistake is something that I think has been, that's been a category mistake that we've had for a very long time. And I think that what the pandemic did is made it all that much more visible.
Yes.
And it elevated those positions to the status of religious positions in a way. And it's that kind of, I'm tempted, it's an idolatry of a kind, right? And it's that, I think, that is the offense here. Yeah. It's that is the offense. I mean, was it avoidable? Maybe not, right? But I think that is something to be resisted. Now, that's like, all that being said, like, proper precautions, reasonable precautions, keeping people safe and secure is certainly not something to be shirked. But I think it also has to be, again, set against a kind of broader normativity in virtue of which we're deciding that these things are valuable, right? And it's the order of value. It's the hierarchy of priority that I think has been hard to find. Sorry, I went on a little bit of a ramble there, Maitreya. I apologize.
No, not at all. That was great. Yeah, I really appreciated that. And I think you're absolutely right. And the way that modernity has stripped away all of our traditions, all of our religions, all of our spiritual philosophies, and essentially left us as empty vessels that worship science to a degree, worship economic progress, worship the dollar. Yeah, it has resulted in the meaning crisis, and COVID has highlighted and emphasized that lack quite strongly, because in a time of crisis, you look to your spiritual communities and your spiritual leaders for guidance. And when we're living in a time of modernity, in a time of relative isolation in modern Western society, when we look for those people, they're not there. And so where do you turn? And like you were saying, people turn to politicians or the medical community, and it's like needing an electrician and calling a plumber. Like, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And so, yeah, it's, to me, what it brings up is, it's like an aspirational quest as a culture to develop the kind of infrastructure that can guide us as a society to collectively and individually find the kind of developmental things that we're missing currently. And spirituality is one of those things, very, very clearly to me. We don't value spirit as a culture right now, and we don't value meaning. What's meaning and what gives our lives purpose as a culture right now. And yeah, in some ways, COVID has been a blessing for that, because it's highlighted that. But I also think you're right in that message and that learning will go mostly unheeded by most people. And so we may actually not change anything as a result of this. There may be some observation of that fact, but then we just keep on trucking as we have been. And what does it take to change a culture? Maybe it's just maybe it naturally happens over time, over centuries rather than decades. But I don't know. I don't know.
I don't know either. And I think that that's one of the reasons why, in some ways, the work, not to, as I'm about to say this, I find myself taking some kind of hyper individualist position, and it's like, I do that sort of in spite of myself in a way. But in some ways, the sort of the ebbs and flows, these tectonic shifts of the culture, not to say that they can't be influenced, not to say that we can't intercede and try to contribute to the way in which they're being vectored. But I mean, God, the order of complexity to this is beyond any of us. Some people can make some deeply, deeply rich contributions to this, the effects of which will resonate in ways that we can't imagine. So it's not as though the work going into this, to examine it, the work going into to develop a relationship with the crisis, to develop a relationship with the problem, and to try to dialogue with it as adroitly as possible. I think there's valor to that project, but I also think that it needs its corresponding humility. You know what I mean? There's no fast panacea to this, and I remain unconvinced that there's going to be some kind of cultural, sweeping cultural panacea that's going to come and somehow consolidate everything and reintegrate, and there's going to be some kind of syncretic, you know what I mean, or utopic consolidation of our spiritual life that awakens in a form of unity. That you know what I mean? That's sort of like that kind of utopic thinking I'm really, really wary of. Yes. Really wary of. And unfortunately, some of that thinking happens even among these very, wisely toured, thoughtful conversations that are happening in this, this virtual space that you and I are now part of. It's like, even in that space, which is generally, I think, a lot more educated and a lot more thoughtful, and a lot more a lot more perspicuous with its thinking and its subtlety of thinking. Even this arena falls prey to that sometimes. Even this arena falls prey to the utopic projection, or the messianic projection, the idea that somehow we're going to be able to regather all of these disparate bits and pieces that have been scattered across the surface of the world, and wreathe everything back together again. I mean, as though it was perfectly wreathed in the first place, right? Which would be which would be a fallacious thing to say too. So I guess what I mean by that is, I think that work right now, I think that work is best undertaken at a much more modest scale. First, at the level of the individual, because I think if you can't sort yourself out, it's starting to sound like Peterson, but I mean, there's a reason that he galvanized as many people as he did. If you can't pull yourself together, if you can't prescind your own projections from the world, if you can't achieve a certain amount of intrapsychic integration, such that where you end and the world begins, because I think a lot of people don't know, and I'm not excluding myself from that, where I end and the world begins, and what that means in the first place. What kind of metaphysics is that statement even premised on, right? How do I understand myself as a self? What does that mean to me, right? If we don't back ourselves up onto those fundamental questions and do that work, certainly do that work with the support, certainly like ensconced in a fellowship. I don't think that work should be somehow undertaken in perfect solitude. Definitely not. But I think if we don't undertake that work, then we lapse into a form of that utopic thinking that just becomes quite dangerous. And I'm not saying that has to, I don't mean that there's a necessary it's, such things are never perfectly sequential. It's not like, you can't make a move ever to help another person before you've perfected your personality, right? That's not it either. But I think you know the way in which I mean. I'm starting to qualify myself too much. But I think that it's at that level. It's at that level right now. I think that the work is most meaningful and most necessary, precisely because there's so much. Especially right now, where self-righteousness has become like the dominant form of moralizing, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that that we haven't figured out as individuals. We can't make sense of what's outside of us because we can't make sense of what's inside of us, and haven't realized that the two share an identity on a very, 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 very deep and profound level. And to me, COVID was a perfect example of that. A perfect example of the world, or the ontology of the world around us, or probably more accurate to say the phenomenology of the world around us, changing its presentation as a consequence of how we internalized and how our own interior humors changed. And when the interior humors change, the exterior humors change too, right? And then, of course, it becomes like a vicious circle.
Yeah. I agree with you totally. Well, I agree with you in that that's been my response so far, is that this cultural phenomena, to me, while it's there and I find it interesting, and I appreciate people who are responding to that and doing work on that level, like I deeply appreciate John's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, because it is responding on that level and attempting to give people some context and understanding historically what's led us here, and then how as individuals we can develop ecologies of practices to respond directly to that and find meaning and purpose. That to me is great. And if more people were to take that up, naturally we would see the culture change. But I think whether people take that up or not is a function of the culture as it is today. So it's kind of, it's not, you can't just say to someone, hey, go watch this series, it'll change your life, because they have to be predisposed to that way of thinking or that introspective process already for them to be interested at all in that topic. But yeah, so for me, it is that there's this stuff going on at the level of culture, but then for me, the level of response is at the level of the individual and the level of the community, the local community, because I, correctly knowing my place, I am not capable of responding at the level of culture, because there's a lot of internal work that I need to do as an individual. And so I continue to do that work, continue to introspect and reflect on myself and how I'm living my life, and try to be of service to the people directly in my sphere of influence. So my wife, loving her and taking care of her and trying to help her live the nicest life she possibly can and support her in whatever way I can. My dog, trying to train him to be an obedient little puppy and have a healthy life where he gets enough exercise and enough fresh air and has healthy socialization with other dogs and all that kind of stuff. And my friends, like listening to them when they're going through a rough time and trying to lend them a shoulder to cry on, or just someone to talk to when it's difficult, and vice versa. Have someone there for me when it's tough for me, and then in sort of more professionally, I suppose you would say, like I have trained as a Tai Chi teacher and as a counselor, and I see those as two vehicles for service to my local community. So I can teach people mindfulness. I can teach people to be with their body and their breath and to slow down and get out of the machinations of the very fast moving logical mind that is so addicted and so running at a million miles an hour in our social media driven culture today, that to even give people the tools to step out of that for a while is fantastic. And then counseling, it's like directly talking to people about issues and problems they're facing in their life and trying to give them tools to be able to navigate through those. And so if I can do all of those things on the individual level and on the level of the community, then I feel like I'm contributing in my small way. And that to me is the appropriate response to what's happening at the level of the culture, because that's what I'm capable of right now. That's where I'm at. Yeah.
Yeah. It really warms me, as you've just described it. It really warms me to hear you lay it out like that. It's beautiful. And there is, I think, there's a real nobility in the relative modesty of that scale. And there's courage too. Perhaps paradoxically, there's courage in the relative modesty of that scale, because that is an entire world. That is enough of a world right there to tend, and if you can't do it at that scale, then doing it at any other scale is just going to be impossible. And I know that there's sort of, I struggle with this too, because perhaps one could say there's an implicit contradiction. Well, does that mean that if you're not perfectly arranged and not perfectly harmonized with your immediate environment and with yourself, that you should never attempt to do anything greater? But then, to me, that's a tricky question, right? Because in some ways, ministering to a broader project in many ways is also a way of cultivating yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, I don't think that someone like John, who creates an entire series to try and trace the historical development of this crisis and to offer a proper education. God knows there isn't a lot of that, there isn't a lot of that available. To offer a proper education that is such a valuable project precisely because it enables people to undertake, you said it very well. That enables people to undertake the project individually, right? It becomes an affordance, becomes an environmental affordance for people to internalize and undertake it, right? A provocation, right? A set of equipment and a provocation to equip people to do that, to encourage people to do that. And to outfit people properly with the the inner resources they need to undertake that project, right? And that's how I see it, right? That's how I see the nobility and the valor of that project for me, is that it's not trying to close a fist around the culture, except insofar as it's trying to close a fist around individual souls and cradle them for a moment so that they become conscious of themselves.
Yes.
Conscious of themselves as individuals, conscious of themselves and their role in all of this. Right. But like I said, I'm kind of moved by the way you've described your own set of commitments and what they mean to you. And it's beautiful. It really is. Right down to the dog. And that's important, by the way, like developing a good relationship. And I mean this unironically, like, it's something I've gone through as well. And it incidentally is a source of enormous it can change you, like coming into a proper relationship with a dog. It's just changed me. It's changed me, God. I think in many ways I learned more from my dog than I did from most people I've ever met. Right?
Yes.
And by that I mean learned from the process of coming into a proper relationship with dog.
Yes.
Right? Because the amount of attention, the amount of patience, the amount of feedback, the amount of subtle communication, all of those things have to be tuned and constantly retuned and constantly retuned and constantly retuned and constantly retuned. And the reward of it is something that's so profound and anyway.
Absolutely. To me, there's something joyous about communicating with my dog Otis. It's like, because you can't communicate with him verbally. You can't just speak to him like you would a person. So he understands body language, he understands energy, he understands some commands after I've trained him, and you have to use conditioning to train him to understand those commands. And he has certain instincts that he follows regardless of what I'm doing. So if there's something that he's sniffing and he's distracted, he's going to be sniffing that thing because he's interested in that. And if I tell him to come, then there's no chance he's going to come to me. And if there's a dog walking past our fence on our property, he's going to start barking and get territorial and aggressive. And there's nothing I can do to stop that, short of walking up to him and like putting a leash around him and leading him away and being like, okay, you're fine to bark a couple of times just to let the other dog know that this is your territory. But once I've come into the picture and I've let you know that everything's safe and it's okay and you've warned me sufficiently, that's enough. All right, we can call it down. But to communicate with him is a very different thing. And yeah, it is profound in a way that I haven't been able to find anywhere else outside of that relationship with Otis. So yeah, it's been really rewarding. And what it's also shown me actually is the level of repetition and discipline that's required to teach a command and to reinforce it so that he gets it every time. And it actually, like, it gives me a new take on myself, because it's like, well, in myself, I'm trying to instill new disciplines and new habits and new practices. And I will often let myself off when I'm feeling uncomfortable or it's just inconvenient or whatever it is. And it's like, well, to train a dog, I need to do it every time without missing ever. Because if you miss once, then they think, okay, there's a chance I might be able to get away with it here. It's the same thing in training myself. I kind of need to step back from myself, remove myself, have some detachment and go, if I want to actually learn something well and deeply, I need to give myself no choice and just do it every single time, regardless of my state of being or whatever. So yeah, it's been a learning journey from that aspect as well. It's been really nice. Really enjoyed it.
Totally. God, there's so many. Yeah, there's so many dimensions of it, aren't there? I was also thinking as you were talking of like, you learn so much about what you're about your own. You learn dimensions of your personality surface when you have a dog too, because the dog is like, I mean, the dog is in a position that is wholly inferior to you. I mean, ostensibly, right? If you're beginning to do your job properly, the dog, you're the alpha, and the dog is in a beta position.
Yeah.
And because of that, you are at liberty to treat the dog in ways that you cannot treat other people. And so I had this experience. With my family. We got a dog. I was 19 when we got her, and she's still kicking miraculously. But she's a German Shepherd, very, very high strung, very like smart, mischievous, and very, very, very rebellious. And she went through this phase in the training where she just decided, maybe about her version of adolescence, maybe like 6, 7 months old, 8 months old, where she just decided, yeah, all of those commands that you taught me, I'm forgetting all of that. You know what I mean? It's over. I'm retiring from obedience at the tender age of 8 months, and it coincided with the darkest, coldest part of winter, and I would have class at 9 a.m. or whatnot, and I'm not really a great morning person, so I would inevitably be a little bit late in getting her to the park every morning, and she would refuse to come, and I would be freezing and late for class, and just at my wit's end, and still a rash and impatient young man, and I would get so angry at her, so angry. I loved her so much, but I would get so angry at her. And of course, those two things are fused together. Yeah, I can't get that angry at someone or I think of her as a someone. You can't get angry unless there's deep passion there, right? And I would and when I would catch her on some of those occasions, I would reprimand her, and I would be my anger would just erupt out of me, right? And I mean, she was a big dog and a strong dog, and she could take a lot of it, right? And it's not as though she wasn't physically, at least, she's incredibly resilient. So it's not as though I flayed her or anything like that. But I would get just so incensed, and she would feel it. She would internalize it, So I'd be at class, and I'd get a call from my mom halfway through the day, and she would say, "Yeah, Karma's pretty depressed." And I would say, "Oh, Jesus," and I'd feel guilty for the rest of the day, because I'd known that I let my anger get the better of me, and I let her see it and feel it. And there was no place for that. That's not the way to train, right? But because she was in that position, and all of my attention was dedicated to trying to control her, to make her an extension of my will, and she would refuse to be an extension of my will, a simple, straightforward, unreflective extension of my will, at the time when that's what I thought she needed to be, I would get absolutely incensed. And so then, I'd go home at the end of the day and lie down with her and apologize and try and make up. And I had to learn, time after time, day after day, to try and keep a lid on that temper, and to become more aware of the fact that unconsciously there was this source of anger, there was this source of rage that, that she uniquely and uniquely among entities in my life, could become an object for my rage because of her position relative to me, and because of the fact that I made the mistake of seeing her simply as an extension of my will. And as with many things, right, I needed to differentiate those things in order for us to come back into a unity together, right? You know, the separation needed to be made in order for the reconciliation to be made.
Yeah.
And that was a long process, but a more rewarding, there has never been a more rewarding project, I think, in my life than that, than her. And that was a more profound lesson, I think, than I've received through doing just about anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't have a child. I imagine that would probably supersede karma, much as I love her. But it became such a profound lesson. It taught me that, you know, they can draw out, they being our animals, but especially dogs have a particular way of doing this, I think, that they draw out dimensions of our own nature and help make us conscious of them. And they have to bear, certainly in my case, she had to bear, you know, a lot of immaturity. She had to bear a lot of, you know what I mean?
Yes.
She was saddled with the pains of bearing my own process of coming into maturity. Right? She did that for me. And I choke even thinking about it, actually, because it's a debt. It's a debt. It's a great debt that they do for us when they do something like that for us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And not everyone in our lives is in a position to be that for us, is in the position to be a mirror that will still return to us unconditionally. Yes. That will bear the full brunt of our ill tempers and our foolishness. God, how much foolishness, and still come back. And I think that part of that dimension of that relationship is more profound than most relationships, I think, that exist in the world, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Wow, my pleasure. Yeah. Thanks for bringing up Otis. What kind of dog is Otis?
He's a Maltese poodle.
A Maltese. Oh, okay.
Yeah, he's very small. He's 8 kilos and he's like a caramel blonde color, and he's got a little white patch in his forehead and around his mouth. And he did have white on his paws when he was younger, but he's starting to lose that now. But yeah, he's a beautiful dog. He's a beautiful dog. And it sounds like your German Shepherd, Karma, was very beautiful too. Yeah.
She is. She is still. She's an old girl now, but yeah. It's just incredible, right? The things that they do for us.
Yeah.
And they take up position relative to our personality that can reflect our personality in ways that are more precise, precisely because they are not repurposed or represented through the egoic interests or projections of other human beings.
Yes.
Right? It is a purer form of reflection, a simpler one, right? It can't attain to the levels of complexity, obviously, of a person-to-person relationship in some ways. It's simpler, but in many ways it's less adulterated. It's more precise.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. No, I agree. And as you were talking, I was reflecting on my own journey with Otis, and it's been a lot of that, you know, noticing myself get angry when he disobeys a command, or yeah, it isn't an extension of my will, as you put it. I think that's a really good way of putting it. And then it's for me to reflect upon what it is that's making me angry in that moment, and then try and see if there's a way in which I can still hold him accountable for his actions. So keep the relationship of I'm in control here and you're subordinate to me, because that's healthy for a dog.
Absolutely.
Without the anger. So putting in place a consequence for an action, so he knows that he's done the wrong thing, but not not in order to hurt him or damage him in any way, just so he knows, okay, if I'm going on a walk and I'm off lead and I start chasing kangaroos, that's not the right thing to do. And I'm terrified every time he does, because he'll chase a certain pack of kangaroos, and most of the time they'll just disappear. They'll jump off, and they're much faster than him, so they'll disappear into the distance, and he'll do a big loop, turn around, and come back to me, which is okay. But then sometimes he'll chase a pack, and there'll be a big male kangaroo, and all of them will disappear. And this big male, this one time in particular, I remember Otis chasing, and this big male just turned to him, looked at him, and went, "I'm not moving," and then got back on his hind legs and his tail and like rose up to make himself big. And I'm like, this kangaroo is going to kick the shit out of my little dog. And Otis thankfully veered off, so didn't go after the big male, but veered off and took after the mum and Joey children, and then came back to me. So he wasn't in any danger. But I'm like, if he got anywhere near that kangaroo, he would have been severely injured. So I need to be vigilant about this. This is not a laughing matter. But yeah, it's been interesting for me to go, okay, I need to put in place a consequence, but be mindful of my own anger response and try to tame that as much as I can. Yeah, so yeah, I very much relate to what you're saying.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Hey, God, I feel like we could talk about just this topic for a while, because there's so much there. I mean, it's interesting to see the different ways in which people try and manage the tension in that relationship. Right, there are those that become whose instinct to dominate becomes just hyperextended and becomes inflated and becomes tyrannical. And I found myself at certain times being in danger of that, and had to walk myself back from that. And then there are others who try and who try and use proposition. And this is always really funny to me when they try and use propositions to direct the behavior of their dog. You know, they'll say, "That wasn't very nice. Why did you do that?" Which always really makes me laugh, right? Really makes, because it's about the most comically inefficacious thing you could do. As a dog owner, is try and negotiate your dog into right conduct, which is really funny. Yeah. But again, though, I think it's interesting, right? Between those poles, both of which are ultimately foolish, you have to find a way to it has to be a much more embodied form. As you said, you have to find those ways of physically correcting the behavior, or developing a system of signs.
Yes.
That signify the corrective mechanism and orient the behavior in such a way, and that it can only occur in a physicalized or an embodied form, right? If I were to use, like, John's typology, I might say it's a matter of procedure, not a matter of proposition, right? And it means that you have to it forces you back into your body in certain ways. I think for a lot of people that aren't used to operating that way, right? It forces the process of communication into a more embodied form.
Yes.
And that deepens it, and it makes it more conscious, and it makes it more intentional and more deliberate and more purposeful, right? It refines the precision of communication. And the intentionality of that communication in a way that we are not accustomed to often as people, because to take what you were talking earlier about opinions, opining, and their currency of opinions are so inflated that they are practically meaningless. And it's right not to set much stock by them, because they change anyway. They blow in the wind practically. But that kind of procedural and embodied taking of a position, and that movement in space, the conveyance and the gesture, all of those things that go into the procedural orientations and the perspectival orientations too, if I were to continue up that chain, between man and dog, as it were, have to relinquish a lot of that more superfluous propositional content in order to be effective.
Yes.
And that is a good training. That is a good training, right? It's a very meditative training, I would imagine.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And yeah, and it's, to me, it's reducing my propositions to the bare essentials. So instead of, oh, just go and get your toy, it's toy. Like that's it. It's
That's
one single word, and that's it. It can't be on your mat. It has to be mat. Like that's
Matt.
it. Yeah.
Right. Because it has to be trenched and has to cut through the fog of stimuli,
Yes.
right? Which for a dog, it's like it's pouring in.
Exactly.
You got to cut through it somehow, right?
Exactly.
There's a sharpness of intent that has to be communicated.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. This has been wonderful. I didn't know where we were going to go today, but we've just gone on a little meandering journey, and wow, it's been really nice getting to know you and getting to understand more about you as a person. I really enjoyed getting to hear your story about, you and Karma, and yeah, getting to understand your way of seeing things more intimately. I feel like, yeah, it's been really cool. So thank you for spending some time with me.
Thank you. And likewise, you were a very gracious host. There were all kinds of questions that I was going to ask you and never ended up asking you. So I guess we're just going to have to talk again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to, for sure.
But the pleasure's really been mine. And I really enjoyed it too. I enjoyed the twists and turns and where we ended up. I love that we ended up talking about our dogs. That seems just perfect.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.